In the spring of 1940, Germany stood victorious. France had fallen. Britain stood isolated. And in the grand offices of Berlin, military planners gathered around polished tables, mapping out what seemed like an inevitable future. The mood was one of confidence, almost casual certainty. When these men looked westward across the Atlantic, they saw America through a particular lens, a lens ground and polished by their own assumptions. They saw a nation weakened by the Great Depression, a country that had spent the 1930s building parks and dams rather than tanks and planes. They saw isolationist sentiment. America first rallies, a population that seemed determined to stay out of Europe's conflicts. The German intelligence services, the WWII, compiled reports on American military capacity. These reports, bound in leather folders and stamped with official seals, painted a picture of a nation unprepared for modern war. The American Army, they noted, ranked somewhere around 17th in the world, smaller than Belgium's. American tanks were obsolete. American aircraft were few. The reports stacked up on desks in Berlin, each one confirming what German planners already believed. But there was something these reports couldn't capture, perhaps. They catalogued what existed but failed to imagine what could exist. They counted the soldiers in uniform but not the factories standing ready. They measured the present moment, but not the potential within it. In German military academies, officers had studied American history. They knew of the Civil War, they'd read about American industrial capacity in the abstract. But somehow, in the calculating chambers of their minds, they'd filed this information away as historical curiosity rather than contemporary threat. America was vast, yes, but vast in the way of an ungainly, disorganized thing, not vast in the way of coordinated power. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of German intelligence, walked the corridors of his Berlin office, past filing cabinets filled with data on American steel production, automotive manufacturing, electrical generation. The numbers were there, extraordinary numbers, but they seemed disconnected from military reality. After all, America was an ocean away. America was building cars for housewives, not weapons for soldiers. In the cafes of Berlin, where officers gathered over coffee and cigarettes, the conversation often turned to America. There was a curious mixture of fascination and dismissal. American jazz played on the radio. American films had filled German cinemas before the war. But this cultural presence somehow made America seem less threatening rather than more. It was the land of entertainment, of commerce, of soft, civilian life. The German General Staff had developed elaborate war games, theoretical exercises played out on maps with wooden blocks representing divisions and corps. In these games, America rarely featured as a major player. The games focused on the Soviet Union to the east, on Britain across the Channel. The Atlantic Ocean was a vast moat that made American intervention seem distant and abstract. And so the reports continued to arrive, and continued to confirm, and the comfortable assumptions settled deeper into the foundations of German strategic thinking. Outside the windows of those Berlin offices, the city went about its wartime rhythm. Streetcars clattered past. Office workers hurried through their days. And across an ocean they barely contemplated as a strategic threat, something was beginning to stir. The spring air in Berlin was cool and promising, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the hour with slow, measured tones. Let your mind drift now to another place, to the American Midwest in those same years, to the factory floors of Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland. These were spaces that would become the arithmetic of war, though few yet realized it. Picture a factory floor in 1940. Vast and echoing. The machinery sits partially idle. The Depression has left its mark here, in the scattered workforce, in the cautious production schedules, in the sense of capacity unused. But walk these floors carefully, notice what's actually here. The machine tools are sophisticated. The assembly lines exist. The electrical systems hum with potential. This isn't absence, its dormancy. The American automobile industry had spent the 1920s and 1930s perfecting something extraordinary: the art of mass production. Henry Ford's assembly lines had become temples to efficiency. General Motors had refined the logistics of moving parts and materials across vast distances. Chrysler had mastered the coordination of hundreds of suppliers feeding into central assembly points. These techniques, these organizational systems, they had been developed to build cars. Millions upon millions of cars. In 1940, America produced more automobiles than the rest of the world combined. But the German planners, reading their intelligence reports, saw this as a civilian achievement, irrelevant to military power. They failed to ask a simple question: what happens when you turn these assembly lines toward military production? In the offices of the War Department in Washington, some minds were already working through this calculation. Staff officers were beginning to sketch out scenarios, planning documents with titles like Victory Program, that contemplated extraordinary transformations. These documents estimated what might be possible if American industry fully mobilized. The numbers they projected seemed almost fantastical. Thousands of tanks per month. Tens of thousands of aircraft per year. Ships launching from shipyards at a pace that defied historical precedent. These planners understood something about American industrial architecture. They understood that the capacity existed not just in the machines themselves but in the knowledge of how to coordinate complexity. Consider the American electrical grid, the most extensive in the world. Consider the railroad network, hundreds of thousands of miles of track connecting raw materials to factories to ports. Consider the petroleum industry, the wells, refineries, and distribution systems that could fuel mechanized armies. Consider the agricultural surplus that could feed both civilians and soldiers without strain. These were not military systems, not yet. But they were convertible. They represented potential energy waiting for activation. In small machine shops across the heartland, skilled workers maintained capabilities that would prove crucial. Tool and die makers who could translate designs into production reality. Welders who understood metallurgy. Electricians who could wire complex systems. Logistics coordinators who moved goods across continental distances. The German assessment had catalogued America's small standing army but missed America's large standing capability. It was a category error, mistaking the mobilized present for the mobilizable future. In the spring of 1940, a visitor to an American aircraft factory might have seen a modest operation, perhaps a few planes per week rolling out of a small facility. The German observers noted these numbers dutifully. But they didn't see the blueprints being drawn up for massive expansion. They didn't see the negotiations with workforce recruiters. They didn't see the financial mechanisms being prepared to fund transformation. On those factory floors, as day shifts ended and night shifts began, the machinery cooled slightly, heat dissipating into the evening air. Outside, the Midwestern twilight settled over rail yards and warehouses. Somewhere, a freight train's whistle echoed through the gathering dark, a long, low note that faded slowly into silence. Now let's drift deeper, into the realm of numbers and the curious way they can deceive. In Berlin, the statisticians and analysts compiled their figures with Germanic precision. They created tables comparing steel production, coal output, aluminum manufacturing. These tables showed, accurately, that Germany's industrial base was formidable. The numbers were real, the capacity was genuine. But there was a number they kept missing, a multiplier they failed to apply. It was the number of months, the time it would take for American capacity to transform from potential into kinetic reality. German planning operated on a particular assumption about time. The war, they believed, would be decided quickly, in months rather than years. This assumption shaped everything. If the war would be short, then American industrial potential was irrelevant. There would be no time for it to matter. This was the first mathematical error, mistaking desired timeline for probable timeline. The second error was more subtle. It involved understanding not just capacity but scalability. German industry was efficient, organized, technologically advanced. But it was also finite. It operated near its ceiling. Every tank produced in Germany required resources carefully allocated from a system running close to maximum output. American industry in 1940 was nowhere near its ceiling. It was operating at perhaps 30% of possible wartime capacity. This meant something extraordinary. America could triple or quadruple its output without requiring fundamental technological breakthroughs, just mobilization of existing capability. Think of it like a muscle. German industry was a muscle flexed to near maximum contraction. American industry was a much larger muscle barely tensed. The German analysts, looking at a snapshot moment, compared the two muscles in their current state, and concluded they were roughly comparable. They failed to consider what happened when both flexed fully. The third error involved resources. Germany was dependent on imports for crucial materials, oil from Romania, iron ore from Sweden. These supply lines were vulnerable, subject to interdiction, political pressure, geographic limits. America, by contrast, had most crucial resources within its own borders or easily accessible from allies. Oil from Texas. Iron ore from Minnesota. Copper from Montana. Aluminum from the Pacific Northwest. This meant American production could scale without the constraints that would inevitably throttle German output. As the war lengthened, German factories would increasingly struggle for resources. American factories would face no such constraint. In the quiet offices where these calculations took place, there was also a cultural bias at work, one harder to quantify but perhaps more decisive. German military culture valued quality over quantity, the perfectly engineered solution over the mass-produced good enough. This was reflected in German weapons design, tanks that were technological marvels but complex to build and maintain. American industrial culture had evolved differently, toward standardization, interchangeable parts, assembly line logic. An American tank might be less sophisticated than a German one, but if you could build 10 American tanks in the time it took to build 3 German tanks, the mathematics shifted decisively. The German analysts looked at individual unit quality and missed the strategic significance of producibility. They admired their own engineering excellence while failing to appreciate the power of industrial scalability. And so the reports continued to circulate in Berlin, each one confirming that America, while large, was not a decisive threat. The numbers seemed to support this conclusion, if you asked the right questions and ignored the wrong ones. In those calculation rooms, as evening fell, desk lamps cast small pools of light over spreadsheets and statistical tables. The numbers sat there, precise and misleading, while outside, the Berlin night deepened and stars emerged in the spaces between clouds. December 1941. And everything changed in a moment that seemed to come from nowhere but had been building for years. The attack on Pearl Harbor was Japan's decision, but it became America's catalyst. In the days following December 7th, something shifted in the American consciousness, a gear engaging, a switch thrown. The isolationist sentiment that had seemed so powerful, it didn't disappear exactly, but it was suddenly channeled in a new direction. The energy that had resisted involvement now poured into mobilization. President Roosevelt addressed Congress, asked for a declaration of war against Japan. Then, in a decision that still seems almost casual in its world historical significance, Hitler declared war on America. He didn't have to, the tripartite pact with Japan didn't require it. But he made the declaration anyway, perhaps believing it formalized an inevitability, perhaps thinking it wouldn't ultimately matter. This was the final and most catastrophic miscalculation. Hitler had just voluntarily engaged in industrial power that could now focus its full attention on Europe without political constraint. In the months that followed, the transformation began. It didn't happen all at once, these things never do. But week by week, month by month, the American industrial machine reconfigured itself. Automobile factories retooled. The assembly lines that had built Chevrolets and Fords now built tanks and aircraft engines. The transition wasn't seamless. There were bottlenecks, shortages, coordination problems. But the fundamental capability was there. The knowledge of how to organize complexity, how to maintain quality at scale, how to coordinate thousands of suppliers into unified output. Women entered the factories in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda, she was demographic reality. The workforce expanded rapidly, drew on populations previously excluded from industrial work. This represented another resource Germany couldn't match: human capital at scale. By 1942, the numbers were beginning to shift. American aircraft production exceeded German production. By 1943, the gap had become a chasm. America was producing more aircraft than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. Similar patterns emerged in shipbuilding, vehicle production, weapons manufacturing. The Liberty ships, these were perhaps the perfect symbol of American industrial logic. They weren't beautiful ships. They weren't sophisticated ships. They were welded rather than riveted, a faster, less traditional technique. But they could be built in weeks rather than months. American shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. This was the arithmetic asserting itself, the mathematics of industrial capacity overwhelming the mathematics of tactical excellence. In German high command, the intelligence reports began to reflect a new reality. The tone shifted from confidence to concern, from dismissal to alarm. But by then, the machine was in motion. You cannot quickly reverse industrial momentum, especially when your own resources are constrained and your enemies are expanding. The German officers who had once discussed America with casual dismissal now pored over reports with growing unease. The factory floor they had ignored was now producing the instruments of their defeat. The sleeping giant had woken, and it turned out the giant was even larger than the pessimists had feared. By 1943, the outcome was no longer in serious doubt, though the fighting would continue for 2 more years. The miscalculation had become undeniable. The comfortable assumptions had shattered against the reality of what America could do when fully mobilized. In those command rooms, as staff officers studied the latest production figures, you could almost feel the weight of realization settling, heavy and cold, while outside, the winter of 1943 deepened over a Europe caught in the grip of total war. Now, as we approach the end of our quiet journey, let's consider what this story whispers to us across the decades. The German miscalculation about American power wasn't unique. History is full of similar errors. Nations and leaders consistently misjudge potential adversaries, see what they expect to see rather than what exists. The pattern repeats, a kind of rhythm in human affairs. What made this particular miscalculation so consequential was its scale and its timing. Germany bet everything on speed, on winning before American potential could actualize. When that bet failed, when the war extended into years rather than months, the structural advantages of American industrial capacity became decisive. There's something almost inevitable about it in hindsight, the way massive productive capacity eventually overwhelms qualitative advantages. But inevitability is a trick of retrospective vision. At the time, nothing was inevitable. The assumptions seemed reasonable. The intelligence seemed sound. The calculations appeared logical. This is perhaps the deeper lesson, that rational people, working with real data, can still reach catastrophically wrong conclusions. The error wasn't in the facts themselves but in which facts were considered relevant, in which questions were asked and which were ignored. The German planners asked, "How many tanks does America have now?" They failed to ask, "How many tanks could America build?" They asked, "How large is the American army?" They failed to ask, "How large could the American army become?" They measured the present, and assumed it represented something fundamental rather than something temporary. In the quiet archives where historians now study these decisions, you can trace the thread of assumption through memo after memo, meeting notes, intelligence assessments, strategic planning documents. The pattern is consistent. American capacity acknowledged but discounted. American potential noted but not fully credited. Why? Perhaps because fully crediting it would have required admitting that the war was unwinnable, and that admission was psychologically impossible for leaders who had already committed to the conflict. Perhaps because the alternative required imagining a transformation so vast it seemed unrealistic. Perhaps because distance, physical and psychological, made American power feel abstract rather than concrete. By 1945, as Germany surrendered, American industrial capacity had produced staggering numbers. Nearly 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 2,700 Liberty ships plus thousands of other vessels, millions of tons of munitions. The sleeping factory floor had woken, and when fully roused, it had produced material on a scale that still seems almost unbelievable. The lesson echoes forward through time, relevant not just to military planners but to anyone who makes strategic decisions. Assumptions are dangerous. Present conditions are temporary. Potential is harder to measure than actuality, but sometimes more important. In the quiet of this moment, as our story comes to rest, consider how often we all make smaller versions of this error. How often we measure what is and forget to imagine what could be. How often we see the factory floor at rest and fail to envision it humming at full capacity. History doesn't repeat, they say, but it rhymes. And the rhythm of this particular story, the cadence of assumption meeting reality, it's a rhythm worth listening to as you drift towards sleep. And so our journey through this curious chapter of history comes to a gentle close. Let these stories settle into your mind like dust motes in evening light, drifting, peaceful, finding their place in the quiet spaces of memory. The miscalculations of the past need not trouble you now, they're simply echoes from another time, lessons whispered across the years. As you drift towards sleep, let go of the need to remember everything, let the details blur and soften. What remains is simply the rhythm of history, the slow, inevitable way that assumptions meet reality, the patient unfolding of consequence from decision. Sleep well, rest deeply, and perhaps tomorrow, carry with you just one quiet thought, that potential is often invisible until it awakens, and that what seems impossible in one moment can become inevitable in the next. Good night.